Uh, Now it is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker today. Um, Natalie Baszile is the author of We Are Each Other's Harvest, Celebrating African American Farmers, Land, and Legacy, coming from Amistad in April of next year. Natalie is the author of Queen Sugar, and her new book is a gorgeous full-color celebration of Black farmers and farming in America. It's told through photography, testimony, poetry, and essays, and I can't wait to hear her talk more about it. And even more, I can't wait to sell it next year. So thank you so much for joining us today, Natalie. Introducing Natalie Baszile.
Wow, thank you so much. It just means a lot to me to have been invited to speak to everybody today. So my new book is called We Are Each Other's Harvest, Celebrating African American Farmers' Land and Legacy. And I think I want to start first by saying that I found that title, it's actually part of a Gwendolyn Brooks poem. And the poem, the lines, these are the last 3 lines of the poem, and they read, "We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond." And when I came across that quote, it was like a light bulb went off, because I really felt that it really expressed the theme and the feeling that I want to convey in this book. This is a book that's celebratory, even as it explores, challenging themes in telling the stories of these farmers. But it's really meant to be a celebration and just an experience of joy as we kind of immerse ourselves in this history. So the book really explores a lot of the same issues that I was looking at when I started to write Queen Sugar. I was curious about the stories of Black farmers, farmers of color, because often when we think about, the American farmer, we often think about like an old white guy. And I knew that that wasn't the case. And so I really wanted with this book to draw our attention to this other history that I think is so often overlooked. And I tried to explore it and a lot of the other questions around farming and land ownership and agriculture and all of these big questions that we tend to think of as being part of our past, but that are very much tied to our present. As a storyteller, I've always been interested in the story of Black farmers. And part of that is just my own fascination and my own kind of private, love of farming and gardening and being connected to the earth. But part of it also has a lot to do with my own personal history. Queen Sugar kind of explored my Southern roots on my dad's side. But this book also pays homage to my mother's side of the family. And it turns out that my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side was a gentleman by the name of Mac Hall. He was born in 1845. And after emancipation, I have learned that he was a beekeeper, a merchant, and a farmer who owned almost 600 acres of farmland near Tuskegee, Alabama. And so I found out this about him as an adult, but really it really explains a lot about, my family's values and the way I was kind of brought up with this understanding that land is essential, land is important. It's been part of my family legacy, and I wanted to really try to impart this and reach out to readers to say, we need to be thinking about this question. So when I started on this journey with this book, I wanted to do a couple of things. First, I wanted to really give some context for this conversation about land and land ownership and land stewardship. As I said, when we think about farming, a lot of us tend to only think about, the story of the farmer in the Midwest, the old white guy who's 65, who's holding on to his family farm. And actually, the story about African Americans and people of color in this country and our connection to the land is as rich and is as deep. If you think about the history of Black people in the United States and our connection to agriculture and the land, it really stretches all the way back to the very first days after emancipation, when land ownership was really critical. And so there's a story that I share in the book as, again, as part of kind of the historical elements in the book. And one of the things that the book explores is the story of General Sherman's Field Order 15. And it turns out that on January 12th, 1865, General Sherman, as he was marching through the southern states in the last days of the Civil War, as he approached Atlanta and the other big cities in Georgia, he dispatched his Secretary of War, a guy named Edwin Stanton, to talk to and meet with 20 Black Baptist and Methodist ministers in Savannah, Georgia. And again, the Civil War was over, the Union had won, and Sherman really wanted to find out what he needed to do for formerly enslaved people. And so he dispatched Stanton to meet with these 20 ministers. And he asked them, Stanton asked them, what do you want for your people following the war? And assembled in this number of 20 ministers was a gentleman by the name of Garrison Frazier, who had been a slave until 1857 when he purchased his freedom. And Garrison Frazier stood up and he said, the best way we can take care of ourselves is to have land and to turn it and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on the land until we were able to buy it and make it our own. And so one of the elements in the book is General Sherman's Field Order 15, which most of us know as 40 acres and a mule. And so what General Sherman did in that case, he set aside a 30-mile wide band of land from Georgia all the way down through Florida. And he set that land aside. It was over 400,000 acres. He set that land aside for formerly enslaved people, and he divided it into roughly 40-acre parcels. And this was the land that was settled by a lot of enslaved people in the Southeast. Well, part of the reason I want to include that story in the book is because that settlement and that early land ownership and that connection to the land really resonates today. For example, part of what I also want to explore in the book as part of the historical component, the historical elements in the book, really is tied to this question of how, after that conversation with Garrison Frazier in 1865, by 1920, Black people owned, there were actually almost 1 million Black farmers in the United States, and Black landowners and farmers accounted for 14% of all of the arable farmland in the United States. That was roughly 35 million acres of farmland that Black people had owned and acquired by 1920. Well, as I was researching this book, I discovered that that number, 14%, 35 million acres, had dwindled down to less than 1%. As actually it's 0.52% of all the arable farmland that Black people now own. And that initial 925,000 Black farmers has dwindled down to 45,000 farmers in the last century. And so part of one of the questions that this book explores is, how did that happen? What has happened since the 1920s that explains this dramatic decline in land ownership? And so in investigating that question, not being a historian myself, I commissioned a couple of essays by historians. One is by a historian by the name of Pete Daniel, who wrote this book called Dispossessed, that really explains the historical connection that, or the historical role that the USDA has played in disenfranchising Black farmers in the last, century. And so Pete Daniel's essay really looks at um, some of the tactics and the strategies that the US has deployed, the USDA has deployed in the last 100 years to really disenfranchise Black farmers. And I'm sure many of you have probably seen in the last, really in the last 3 years, this has become a really important um, issue, this idea of Black land loss and how this has happened. There have been some really big articles published in the New Yorker, ProPublica, The Atlantic. Everybody now is talking about this issue. So in trying to explain this to readers, I wanted to make sure that I had Pete Daniels' voice. I also commissioned or acquired the rights to a fantastic essay called Kicked Off the Land, by a journalist by the name of Lizzie Presser. And Lizzie Presser tells the story of the Rios brothers in North Carolina who spent 8 years in jail trying to protect their land. And there's another factor at work, and it's called heirs property. And this is a case where African Americans after Reconstruction were suspicious of the US government who had betrayed them and really were reluctant to, set up trusts and all this and have wills for their property. Well, in subsequent generations, as the land that they had amassed was distributed among their heirs and then heirs of the heirs, now you have a case where in a lot of African American families, that land is now owned by, hundreds of cousins. And what is happening as part of this land loss issue, speculators are using loopholes in the law to go in and force the sale of this land. And if you think about, for example, going back to General Sherman's Field Order 15 and all this valuable land along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia that has been owned by Black people for generations, that is now places like Hilton Head, South Carolina. And all of a sudden, this land that was undesirable after the Civil War now is desirable and now is valuable, right? And so now you have these speculators who are going in using these unlawful practices to really disenfranchise these families. And so again, as part of the historical element of the book, I wanted to tell that story. And so Lizzie Presser's essay is, I secured the rights to that, and that's one of the components in the book. So that's kind of some of the historical elements. But I also wanted this to be a really dynamic experience for readers. And I know that, having a history book sometimes isn't something that your average everyday reader will gravitate towards. So I wanted to also have other elements in the book that would be accessible to people and would really allow them to see themselves in these stories. And then also to be able to relate it to what's happening today. So I secured the rights to some fabulous poems by some of the most well-respected African-American poets of our day, including Elizabeth Alexander, Ross Gay, Kevin Young, Yusef Komunyakaa, Robin Coss Lewis, who wrote Voyage of the Sable Venus. There's a beautiful poem in there called Frame, where she talks about a farm that was in her neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles. And so that's also another element in this book, are just these poems that speak to land ownership, the beauty of working and having gardens and growing things. And I just felt that would lend just other voices to this kind of you know, anthology of voices that are really trying to get at all of these issues from different points of, from different perspectives. I also thought that I wanted to include something from some of the people who, fellow writers. So there is a conversation actually that I turned into kind of a first person narrative by Jason Wilborn. Jason is one of the writers from Queen Sugar, the series from season 1. And I interviewed Jason. We initially met on the set, and then I went down to Los Angeles and we had a one-on-one conversation where he talked about his own connection to farming. And it turns out his grandfather was a farmer. And so in this essay that I crafted from my interview with Jason, I was able to really share his story about what he brought to the series Queen Sugar, and how he pulled from his own personal story and his own personal family experience. Another element is a conversation that I had with best-selling author Lolita Tatamy and also Margaret Wilkerson Sexton. The three of us sat down and had a conversation that's in the book, really about being daughters of the South, specifically Louisiana. And so there's that conversation that's really all about writing, race, and place, and how we are grappling with these issues and how we all kind of bring our histories and our connections to Louisiana to our artistic practices. So again, the book has a lot of variety. It has a lot of voices. I think there's also an essay by culinary historian Michael Twitty, who writes about, he has his own book called The Cooking Gene. And Michael is a guy who works on the East Coast at, I think it's Jamestown, I can't remember, but Michael wrote an essay for the book. So it's really, I wanted to assemble a variety of voices, a variety of stories to really tell this story about land ownership and who these people are who are doing the work. And finally, and this is where maybe we can jump to the slides, and this is probably the thing I'm most proud of in the book. I spent all of last year really going around and interviewing farmers because, as I said, you know, oftentimes we don't think about people of color being on the land. And so I wanted to actually bring these stories to light. And so my photographer, Allison Guti, and I traveled around not this summer 2020, but 2019, I guess, traveling all around the country, photographing farmers and really interviewing them and then having them tell their stories. And so this first slide is of Naima and Leah Pennyman. They are founders of Soul Fire Farm in upstate New York. And as you can see, I mean, these are young women. These are young people who they call themselves the returning generation. And they are really at the forefront of this movement. And this is one of the reasons why I think this book will really resonate with people, because there is a movement underway among young farmers who are leaving urban centers and who are going back to the land. Leah and her husband, Jonah Vitali Wolf, founded Soul Fire Farm. And I mean, Leah is just a dynamo. She's also on the cover of the book, she and Naima. And they are really leading this movement to educate young people about how to go back to the land, how to start farms. We can go to the next slide. Okay, these are the Blueforts. Mr. Bluford, who is the older gentleman sitting on the left-hand side, is a fourth generation farmer in South Carolina, and those are his three sons who he farms with. And I spent the day with the Bluefords and they tell their story. Mr. Bluford first tells his story about how he can remember farming on the same land with his grandparents and how they would take him out in this little red wagon and park him under a tree like as a little kid. And he remembers when the land that he farms today with his sons was cotton land. And he and his sons share their story of farming, both the challenges, but also the triumphs, and why they are dedicated to holding on to their land and continuing to farm and persevere. And so I'm giving you guys kind of a sneak peek of some of the portraits that are in the book. And this is one of my favorites. This is the Blueforts. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is Marvin Frink. Marvin is a cattle farmer in North Carolina. And his story, when I went to visit him, Marvin is a retired Special Forces vet who suffers from PTSD and farms as a way to actually treat his PTSD. And in his story, he talks about how he was literally on the brink of suicide when his father called him back to Florida, where he grew up, and then connected him with an older Black farmer who was also a cattle farmer. And it was the first time that Marvin, since he retired, really felt like he had a purpose. And he found community and comfort among a herd of cattle. And so now he is farming in North Carolina, he and his wife, Tanisha. And he tells the story about his struggle, but also his triumph, and how he now uses part of his farm as what he calls agrotherapy, so that he invites other retired vets who are also suffering from PTSD to come out to his land and kind of commune with the cattle, where they can be at peace, where it's quiet. And it's just a beautiful story. And Marvin was just incredible. He has just such a big heart and a wonderful spirit. And so his is one of the stories in the book. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a young woman named Melanie Edwards, who I went to visit a year ago in June up in Alaska, of all places. And Melanie is a young woman from Seattle, or the Seattle area, who wants to start a sheep farm. And she was up at this place called Calypso Ecology Center and Farm. It was basically farm school. And I spent 4 days in Alaska with Melanie, filming her and gathering her story. And so she tells her story in her book. Again, I wanted to show a variety of voices, a variety of experiences from all over the country. And so you get to read Melanie's story in the book. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a young guy. His name is Kamal Bell, also in North Carolina. And Kamal he just radiates warmth and generosity. And he is farming. He started a farm called Sankofa Farms in North Carolina. And so in addition to farming, he also is a beekeeper. And he is now working with young Black men from the Durham area. And he brings them out to his farm and trains them in everything from beekeeping to, growing. They cleared all the acreage on his farm by hand. And so Kamal gets to tell his story in the book. And let's go to the next one. Okay, and finally, although the focus of the book is African-American farmers, really, we are each other's harvest. I wanted it to be as inclusive as possible. And so this is the Sandovals, and they farm in South Carolina. And they tell just a moving story about coming to this country and initially working as migrant laborers from Florida all the way up to Michigan. And they did this thing called pin hooking, where after they would farm during the day, the farmers would allow them to go back into the fields and pick up all of the produce that wasn't quite good enough to sell in the first market. They would go back and they would do this thing called pin hooking, where they would take that, the extra produce, and then sell it at kind of a secondhand farmer's market. And so I wanted to include stories of migrant laborers in this book, because that, again, is such an essential part of the American story. And so I have the Sandovals in the book, and another woman, Martha Calderon, who has her own story of farming. And now Martha and her family are some of the largest farmers in North Carolina. And she tells the story of how, in addition to farming, she learned how to speak English on Wheel of Fortune as she was, raising her family, and they are farmers. And I think that's it as far as the slides. Those are just some of the farmers who are in the book, not all. But again, I'm really trying to tell a story of celebration, of perseverance, of resilience. That's what this is all about. And I think I've done enough talking, and I will close it out and take questions in whatever time we have left.
All right, folks, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. I noticed that Jim shared an article about local Black-owned farms to support, which is nice. Thanks, Jim. But yeah. Those photos were beautiful, by the way.
Thank
Natalie.
you. Yeah, so, I have to say, I'm just so grateful. My photographer, Allison, and I traveled around together, and she really did such a beautiful job of capturing these farmers' portraits. And so in the book, I wanted to really make sure that the readers had an opportunity to experience these. And so most, if not all, of the farmer portraits are full page, followed by their first person narratives.
How did you discover your subjects for the book, and how did the selection process go?
Yeah, so it it was kind of funny. The Leah and Naima, the first farmers at Soulfire, were the very first farmers that I discovered on Instagram, if you can believe it. And I found them, I messaged them, I told them what my book project, kind of what I had in mind, and asked if I could come and visit. And then, one thing led to the next, and farmers would introduce me to other farmers, and they would say, oh, you really need to talk to this person, and you really need to talk to this person. And honestly, if I hadn't been on a deadline, I probably still would be traveling around the country, because there's so many beautiful stories to be told. And it was really by word of mouth. A lot of the farmers in the South, I have a friend who works helping a lot of farmers get their kind of taxes in order and their legal documents. And he introduced me to some of the other farmers.
I always start talking when I'm muted. I have a comment from Joanna saying that they have an eco-social justice book club that would love your book.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Well, all of those questions. So, food sovereignty, food justice, climate change, right? All of those issues are part of the conversation in this book, both directly and indirectly, because I think, this quarantine, COVID has shown us that, knowing where our food comes from, thinking about, I'm here in the Bay Area. I remember those orange skies that we experienced earlier in this month because of the fires. And so, I think that these issues about farming and land stewardship are really on people's minds in a way that they have not been, in the broader culture before. And so, for that reason alone, I feel like this book and the conversations that it sparks really could not be more perfectly timed.
Did it again. A couple more questions.
Yeah.
So how has COVID affected the farmers you've interviewed?
Yeah. So I've checked in with the farmers, and for the most part, luckily nobody's families have, contracted the virus, and they have all been able to continue farming. They spend most of their time outdoors anyway. Many of them are in rural areas, so they have not necessarily faced the same impact that we have in some of our, larger metropolitan areas. So far they've been okay. you know, there's no question that, you know, this is a challenging time to be a farmer anyway. So even if they haven't been impacted by COVID, uh, you know, in terms of their ability to get out there and work the land, they certainly all have, you know, had to face challenges about just the markets that they have been able to supply. Um, and I have a range of farmers in the book. Some are produce farmers, some are more traditional, you know, what they call row crop farmers, soybean, cotton, that kind of thing. And they all have had different experiences, but so far, at least everybody's healthy.
That's wonderful news, at least. We
Yeah.
also have a question from Calvin. Wanted to bring up the documentary we were talking about
Uh,
earlier.
yeah. And so I am really working with my creative partner to develop a docu-series that we're calling Harvest. And it really takes a lot of the themes and in some cases even the stories that are in the book. And we are trying to develop a television series that would first look at farmers of color domestically, and it would really give me a chance to go back and revisit some of these stories that I wasn't able to include, uh, and then have them tell their stories. And then ideally, we will be global and we'll be able to, you know, travel around and talk to farmers in India and Thailand and Mexico and, you know, just all over the globe. So we're in the early development stages for that.
Either way, I'm excited to
Thank you.
watch out for that. We're all excited and to sell your new upcoming book and buy
Thank
it
you.
ourselves.
Thank you so
But
much.
yeah,
Well, yeah, I just, you know, I am an indie bookseller or indie book lover. Green Apple is my local bookstore. So, you know, again, I just really appreciate this chance to, you know, share this new project with you. So thank
thank
you
you.
again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you
Absolutely.
everyone for your questions as well. But yes, thank you again. I'm going to give you a little clap with the
Okay.
reactions because that's all I can say.